All right, I will say good morning. Let us begin. We are picking up in Meretz Hashem, the end of Os Mem Tes in Tzidkas Hatzaddik, page Kuf Yud Ches. So if you remember again, we were discussing, the Rebbe was advancing the incredible idea that the person has to identify their greatest source of weakness in life. My avoda, my tafkid, my primary mission becomes to go ahead and address that particular avoda or that particular weakness. And then once I'm able to conquer that weakness itself becomes the greatest source of strength. That was the incredible and really, I think, life-altering perspective of the Rebbe. That's what he remember when we began Os Mem Tes. So when the Rebbe spoke about this idea about your weakness becoming your greatest strength, at first, remember again, the way he spoke about it was that if you committed an Aveiro with a particular part of your body, so the goal is to be able to do a mitzvah, do as many mitzvahs as you can with that same part of the body. So I've used some part of my physicality to drive a wedge between myself and the Ribono Shel Olam. So now my job is to go ahead and use that same part of the body do something productive, to do something meaningful, to do something holy. But now Tzaddik went on and he explained this even in a deeper fashion, namely that we all have our struggle, the thing that I've struggled with for so long. That is the reason why I'm here in this world. And if I find a way to address that, and I find a way to overcome that, that weakness in and of itself becomes the very source of my strength. So he gives an example of this. He says, Halotira. Let's look around page Kuf Yud Ches. We're going to finish Os Mem Tes with this idea. Shalotira. Shahaya Achaz Melech Yehuda. Shuchasam HaTorah. Achaz, who was the king of Yehuda. And literally, again, he closed up the Torah. He closed up the Torah. Achaz was an incredible Oved Avodah Zarah. Incredible idolater. But sometimes in Jewish history, when there were times of incredible idolatry, so people still, interestingly enough, believed in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. As counterintuitive as that may seem, they worshipped idolatry, but they also worshipped Hashem. Achaz closed the door on Torah. He sealed up Talmud Torah. There was no Torah during the days of Achaz. Kimosha Amru Chazal, B'Gemara Perek Chilik V'Darshu Od Zos Mi'Apasuk, Sur Tu'uda Chasum Torah B'Limud, Bod Yoser Amru Medrash, Shemana es halimut shel tinokos beis rabon kedei limnoa chat shalom es hashras hashchina b'Yisrael. There was another piece. The other piece was that Achaz prevented the children from learning. So Achaz went ahead and pretty much outlawed Talmud Torah, and he also prevented the children from learning. She'amar Achaz hamelech im ein gediyim ein tayashim, because Achaz said, literally again, if there are no lambs, there are no rams. Which means that if you go ahead and you prevent the children from learning, they cannot develop into Torah scholars. And the truth is, the days of Achaz were some of the darkest days in Jewish history. Some of the darkest days. Right, where again, you had Achaz outlawing the learning of Torah, no learning, shut down the yeshivas, prevent the children from growing. He goes on, Harishi Yitzhar Hara, Hiskabra love Bioser, Ve'inyan Bitla Torah, V'zel Lefi Shahaisa Temuna Boas Skula, Va'koach HaMiyuchal Arbatzas Torah. So this is incredible. So you look at Achaz, and what was his greatest weakness? His greatest weakness was that he caused bittul Torah, caused the negation of Torah study. So again, remember, based on what Reb Tzaddik said, whatever your greatest weakness is, that also has the capacity to become your greatest strength. Once you identify it and remedy it, it becomes your greatest strength. He says, Shehu hayakli muchan. I'm sorry. So we'll say, so what does it mean, says Reb Tzaddik? Because Achaz's greatest weakness was bittul Torah, that showed that embedded within him was this dynamic capacity for harbatzas HaTorah, to cause and to create the proliferation of Torah. Now, how would Achaz do that? Shehu haya kli muchan laholit es Chizkiyo hamelech. Because who was Achaz's son? Achaz's son was none other than King Chizkiyo. And the Hatzaddik writes, "V'habanim im ma'amki leiv ha'avos k'mo shemei Rabbeinu lalan." We'll see this. We'll say a little bit later on that a son sometimes is the greatest expression of what a father truly has inside of him. So Achaz, who was mevatel Torah on every single level, births a son like Chizkiyo. Now, what happened with Chizkiyo? Left-hand paragraph. Be'orech Hasidus, page Kuf Yud Ches. Shahaya marbitz Torah b'chol am Yisrael b'yoser. There was never a person throughout Jewish history who taught so much Torah, who caused the proliferation of Torah within Klal Yisrael, like Chizkiyo. Never happened. Kidi Isa sof parakama devav b'kamo shebe b'tiraso nichlu chachmei Yisrael sefer Torah amitaso v'amru limeid zeh mashakasu bazeh. When Chizkiyo died, the rabbis of his generation did something that was never done for anyone else. They put a sefer Torah on his bed next to him. They were carrying out the funeral bier to bury him. They put a sefer Torah on his bed, and they said, "Limeid zeh mashakasu bazeh." This one taught that which was written in this one. They never did that for any other Talmud Chacham besides Chizkiyo. Ukimo shadarshu Chazal parak sheni b'Sanhedrin ala pasuk yiras Hashem itishalal zedarshu Chizkiyo shayosim darsha Moshe v'Yoshua. Chizkiyo's generation was greater than the generations of Moshe and Yehoshua. V'hakol mipnei sheshmanu Chizkiyo hayadolik b'batei midrashos. And again, the expression they use is that the oil never ran out in the Beis Medrash of Chizkiyo. What does that mean? That Chizkiyo himself created a revolution of Torah learning, to the point that the Gemara says, "Ba'at shalom nimtza am ha'aretz b'yamav." Listen to this statement. There was no am ha'aretz in the days of Chizkiyo. There was no am ha'aretz. There was no such thing as an unlearned person in the days of Chizkiyo. So what happened? Ay masha masupar Ekshe Chizkiyo hamelech na'atz cherev al Pesach beis hamedrash va'amar kol mi she'eino osek b'Torah daka b'cherev zu. That's very interesting. He had an interesting approach. What did he do? Chizkiyo walked into the beis medrash. He put a sword into the earth, and he said, "No one leaves." No one leaves. It is an interesting chinuch methodology, right? No one leaves, but it worked. And listen to what the Gemara says. Ubatku midan va'ad Be'ersheva v'lo matzu am ha'aretz migvas va'ad Antipris v'lo matzu tinok v'tinokes ish v'isha shelo hayu bikim b'hilchos tuma v'tayra. Listen to what the Gemara says, and it worked because they checked throughout Eretz Yisrael, and there was not one am ha'aretz, to the point that every single man, woman, and child were proficient in the laws of Tum and Tara. We've been around the block enough to know that the laws of Tum and Tara are not pashit. But in the days of Chizkiyahu HaMelech, every single man, woman, and child was versed in those halachas. Hurry. So what do you see over here? What do you see over here? You see a father and son, Achaz and Chizkiyahu, direct opposites of each other. Direct opposites of each other. Achaz negated Torah in every corner of the world. In every corner of Eretz Yisrael. He closed up the Torah, prevented the children from learning. Chizkiyahu went ahead and caused the proliferation of Torah more than the days of Moshe and Yoshua. Chizkiyahu's days were the golden age of Jewish scholarship. People knew Torah. There was no such thing as an Am Ha'aretz. Says Reb Tzaddik, what do you see from here? You see that Chizkiyahu's greatest accomplishment was mamish the polar opposite of his father's greatest avera. So Hatzaddik says, what do you see from this? Shetamid hamala miyuchedesh shasida lios ba'adam mofia mikodem obo o bekodmav ba'ose inyan bechisaron miyuchad. So you see from here, says Reb Tzaddik, that sometimes again our greatest strengths in life come from our greatest weaknesses. So we'll say there's one very important piece in this story, which is the first thing that Chizkiyahu did when he became king. We actually mentioned this in Daf Yomi not so long ago. Was Garar, he went ahead and he dragged his father's body on Mita Shechavalim, on a bed of ropes. So the first thing, meaning what he did is he repudiated his father's legacy. He said, I am not my father. I have nothing to do with my father, and I will be the exact opposite of my father. So Reb Tzaddik says, you see from here something dramatically amazing, and this is how everything closes out. Look how he writes, page Kuf Yotes. With this, we'll conclude. He writes, "V'choshekin sheba'osa adam atzmo yesh lahavin mitoch chulshasav v'hisrachuso me'or Hashem yisbarach be'inyan mesuyam." And says Reb Tzaddik, this is the message in life. The message in life is identify your weaknesses, but more importantly, says Reb Tzaddik, identify the weakness. Because although many of us struggle, or all of us struggle with many things, there's usually one acute thing I struggle with. That is my weakness. That is the weakness. But that weakness, says Reb Tzaddik, if identified and if addressed, becomes the very source of my strength. In other words, they're both saying, when I identify the weakness and I combat that weakness and I overcome that weakness, the strength that comes from that, that's going to be my greatest strength. The weakness I conquer becomes my greatest source of life strength. So both say, we often don't think about it this way. We often think that we have two skills, call it buckets of two buckets, right? There are my strengths and there are my weaknesses. And my goal is to build my strengths and to kind of manage or mitigate my weaknesses. And Rav says, that is not correct. That is not correct. There are strengths, absolutely, but the weaknesses, and specifically the weakness, the thing that I have been struggling with for such a long time, maybe even my entire life, that's the reason I'm here in this world. That's the reason. That's my shlichus. You don't have to be a Chabadnik to have a shlichus, right? That's my shlichus. That's why I am here, to fix that thing. And when I fix that thing, that becomes my greatest life strength. That's the message of Reb Tzaddik. All right, we'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up in Yirtzeh Hashem in Seif Os Nun tomorrow.